Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well wherever you are in the world. And I would like very much to continue the journey through the works of John Carpenter. Today I'd like to talk about the episodes that he directed for the very interesting series called Masters of Horror. And the episode in particular I'd like to talk about today is the one which is called Cigarette Burns. So this is the television series Masters of Horror, created by the very famous Mick Garris, and it is a collection of anthology episodes directed by a master of horror, that is, a director of horror films or someone who is otherwise very famous in the horror cinema industry. And so we have many episodes in this series. I haven't spoken about this particular series specifically on this channel, except with respect, for example, to the episodes that were, say, directed by Dario Argento. Well, now I'd like to focus our attention to those episodes directed by John Carpenter. Let's begin with the episode that he directed, which was, based on my own information, released in 2005, or was broadcast in 2005. That is the work, or the episode, called Cigarette Burns. Now, what I have here is the DVD set from the UK, and this is one of a number of sets that comprise the entirety of the Masters of Horror series. So this is the first part of the first series, and so it includes the episode directed by John Carpenter called Cigarette Burns. And just for information, this DVD, which is from the UK, includes two audio commentary tracks. So the first audio commentary track is with the screenwriters, Drew McWeeny and Scott Swan. And I should say that their rapport is very good. It's a very nice, friendly, bright, lively commentary track, and they pay homage to John Carpenter. They're obviously big horror fans and big John Carpenter fans, and they also give insights into this particular story, which is a very interesting one. So that's the first commentary track found on this particular UK DVD. Next is an audio commentary track with John Carpenter, and here he is by himself, but he is talking about the particular aspects of the production, working with specific actors, and for example, he's talking about working with Udo Kier, and also he's talking about Norman Reedus, the person who plays the main protagonist in the film, and other details like that. He also goes into specifics as to the relative references that are made to the horror genre, and also how it figures into his own concerns as a filmmaker who's made films up to this particular point. He also points to what he sees to be certain production flaws in the film, in terms of, in particular, some aspects of the location and what it's meant to be in the episode versus what it actually was, and things like that. So he shows a certain degree of modesty and honesty, which we have come to know from John Carpenter and his commentary tracks. It's a really excellent one. And then we have, an interview with John Carpenter, which is called Celluloid Apocalypse, and this is about 18 minutes, and this is John Carpenter one-on-one, talking a little bit about his life and his background, and then talking a little bit about his career up to the mid-2000s when this particular series came about. And then He's talking about Mick Garris, and he's also talking about certain thematic points with this particular work, this episode, Cigarette Burns, about the way that cinema is depicted and the way that there are links to things like the idea of Prometheus, or the idea of filming the unfilmable, or the idea of links to his other works, in particular things like In the Mouth of Madness, etc. So it's a well worth checking out. Again, this is 18 minutes, an interview with John Carpenter. And then there is another 18 minutes supplement, which is called Working with Horror. And this is essentially a compilation or a collection of interviews with many people who have, over the course of many years, worked in one way or another with John Carpenter. So, for example, we have excerpts of interviews from Greg Nicotero, Sam Neill, Keith Gordon, Julie Carmen, P.J. Souls, Cheryl Lee, Keith David. And so they are talking about their experiences working with John Carpenter on their respective projects, and also working with him and what his feelings are, how excellent he really is as a filmmaker, not just as a horror genre filmmaker, but as a filmmaker, period. And I think there was one particular point that I thought was really well said, which was John Carpenter as a filmmaker has so much respect and awe for classical Hollywood traditions, and he has such sensibilities that are rooted in such traditions, such that he really could have been a director of any genre he wanted. It just so happened that the horror genre really clicked for him in particular, or the action genre really clicked for him in particular. And so that's what he became known for over the course of his career, of course. But I think he really could have been a director of any field or any type of cinema, because he really has roots and his sensibilities are with this kind of Hollywood classical tradition. Very fascinating collection of interviews. Then there is an on-set interview with actor Norman Reedus, 7 minutes, and he plays the main character in this film, and he's talking a little bit about the story and the motivations of his own particular character and how it progresses, etc. Again, it's about 7 minutes, so it's very brief, but again, well worth checking out. And then there is an interesting supplement about 36 minutes, which is called From Script to Screen. And what this is essentially a dissection of 3 specific scenes from the film. And what it does, it has a little bit of a photo copy, if you will, of the script of a particular scene. And then we hear the audio of it playing out, but we actually see it written on a scripted page that is prepared for purposes of the supplement. And then we see the same scene, but with behind the scenes footage of the rehearsals and the actual shooting of the scene on set, whatever the case may be. And then we see the final scene as it was shown in the final broadcast. And so we have these 3 subparts for each scene that is presented. And so we get to see the actual general process of the creation, again, from script to final product, or from script to screen. Again, a very interesting supplement, especially for those who might be interested in the sort of technical aspects, or how to translate the written word to the screen. So this is From Script to Screen. Then we have a 3-minute behind-the-scenes compilation, and this is essentially but it is a collection of behind-the-scenes footage edited together. There are no interviews here, but it's again still worth one's time. We see John Carpenter on location. We see certain scenes being shot. John Carpenter working with certain actors like Norman Reedus or Udo Kier, for example, and others. So this is also worth checking out. And then there is a special features section, and in that special features section there are 2 subsections. So first there is a 2-minute visual effects section with Lee Wilson, who is a visual effects person on the episode, and here he's talking about the visual effects that went into a couple of particular scenes that are in the film. There are certain aspects of the film that do involve kind of VFX or computer graphics or things of that nature, so we get a little bit of insight into that. And then We have another section, another subsection, which is called outtakes, which is about 1 minute. And this is going through the outtakes of a particular scene that's being played out. And then there are a stills gallery, which is about 2 minutes, and it's an automatically playing stills gallery with music overlaid. And so you can see pictures, various aspects of the production, makeup, etc. And then there is a slideshow, which is in essence a printed out essay talking about the biography and career of the one and only John Carpenter. And then as a DVD-ROM special feature, through those features you can access the actual facsimile of the screenplay if you are interested. So there is a lot packed into this particular UK DVD which I have. So these are the special features that are found on this particular release from the UK of the series Masters of Horror, and in particular with respect to the episode Cigarette Burns. Okay, my friends, so with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about this episode a little bit in terms of spoilers. So if you have not seen the episode and you are okay with a kind of intense, violent horror TV episode, then please turn off this video and try to find the episode and watch it, and then you can come back at any time and this video will still be up. Once again, I must stress that this particular episode is not necessarily for everyone, and so if you don't like particular violent scenes and things of that nature, then I probably would suggest that you avoid watching this episode. But once again, if you are okay with horror and the genre, and you are a particular fan of John Carpenter, and you have not yet seen Cigarette Burns, it certainly is worth checking out. So if you are in that category, please check it out, and then you can come back at any time to this video, and at which time it will be my pleasure to hear your thoughts and your comments with respect to this episode, which is called Cigarette Burns. Okay, you're back, and so that means you've seen this episode of Cigarette Burns, directed by John Carpenter. So as we gather from the supplemental features which are found on this particular UK DVD release, this was a script that was already pre-written, and it was one that John Carpenter seemed to react to quite positively, and so that is how the union was created. And we have an interesting story which is about a film and the power of film in this particular context. The film in question is La fin absolue du monde, or the absolute end of the world. And apparently the notion is by watching the film, somehow the viewers become violent, or it affects the viewers in a way that makes them essentially just go off on everyone and create a sense of madness and danger and terrible violence with respect to each screening. So there is in effect this idea of something that we see or experience causing whatever it might be, hallucinations, or otherwise engendering or encouraging or inspiring very violent acts to be committed. And so what we can say here is that we can see that this already has, in its contents anyway, a kind of linkage to John Carpenter's past. We have already seen in John Carpenter's past filmography films that involve kind of the power, or the overwhelming power of art, and how that plays into this idea of maybe infecting the mind or infecting the souls of those who experience that art. In particular, and I think most strikingly and directly, of course, we have seen this kind of plot play out in, for example, John Carpenter's film In the Mouth of Madness. Granted, in that particular film we were talking about literature or novels or horror novels somehow creating an effect on the reader or the readers, and how that leads to this chaotic paranoia that will become almost like a plague in that particular story. Here we have a similar kind of concept, except now we have a film, and that becomes not only something that is affecting the people in this episode itself, but also us, the viewers, because these the aspects of this infection or the affecting of the mind is also played out in a kind of meta way, because we see this theme or the conceit of the cigarette burn played out visually in terms of the circles that we see flash immediately, which is meant to represent the idea of the cigarette burns on a film that is played in a projector. And I think John Carpenter, in his commentary, perhaps suggested that in the final work, this conceit of the cigarette burn and the mark, which is supposed to indicate the real change for the projector who's running the film projector, probably was not as spelled out or as clearly laid out in the final product as John Carpenter might have wished. I think John Carpenter might have suggested that Mick Garris might have given advice that maybe we should have put up an explanatory note at the beginning of the work in order to explain what a cigarette burn was. But ultimately, it didn't happen, and they tried to explain it in terms of the theater that is depicted here, called the Vogue Theater, and the projector there using cutting out a particular cigarette burn from a film that's being showed there, which is incidentally Argento's Profondo Rosso, which is a nice little touch to the past, horror genre-wise anyway. But in any event, this idea of the film infecting or encompassing not just the world of the episode, but also in a meta way, the world of us, the viewers, as we are watching it, I think plays in very, very nicely with the blending or the melding or the confusion between reality and fiction that we saw in The Mouth of Madness. And it's played out to a certain degree and with certain amounts of success here in Cigarette Burns as well. So there's a really nice link to this cinematic past of John Carpenter, if you will. There's also a kind of searching out of truth or a kind of mystery element. Again, the main character, the Norman Reedus character, is one that is given an assignment by the Udo Kier character to hunt down what might be the only existing print of La Fin Absolue du Monde. And so there is a kind of quest or mystery element, almost like the main character is almost like a detective or gumshoe detective, that sort of thing, in terms of hunting down or going to different people, trying to interview different people, and then from there getting another clue to the next spot, and then from there getting another clue to the next spot and next spot until he finally reaches his destination. And he has a kind of gruff, earthy way about him, the main character does, such that Kirby, right? Such that he almost feels like a sort of down and out detective, which I think is very much in keeping with maybe these film noir detective films that was a very strong, or is a very strong, cinematic tradition, in particular Hollywood cinematic tradition. So I can also say that this story, and as directed by John Carpenter, can also be said to be a kind of linked to a cinematic tradition, namely the detective story or the roman policier type of story or the film noir type of story that might be said to be a way in which John Carpenter is exercising cinematic traditions or classical cinematic traditions, even in the quote-unquote modern age of this particular TV series, Masters of Horror. So again, like with past John Carpenter films and how he links to cinematic traditions both within and outside his own filmography, here I think we have a similar sort of situation in terms of John Carpenter working within his filmography and also working outside of it in a broader cinematic context. And I think it's a very effective work because of it. Now, is it the most effective John Carpenter work ever? Again, that's for you to decide. It is a very interesting and intriguing work. I think, in particular, I mentioned Norman Reedus, who I think provides a very solid performance, and he does have a good sense of sensitivity and also being disturbed by his particular past. And we understand that the main character, Kirby, has a past that he's trying to deal with. We understand that he was married or I think John Carpenter in his commentary describes her as the ex-girlfriend, but I think in the screenwriter commentary, she's described as having married. And in fact, there is an implication that the theater was, I think, a wedding present. I think that's how it was described. So the implication is that they were actually married. And so we understand that there was an issue with this particular woman, the woman that the main character loved in his life, let's call it that way. And there is a certain issue involving chemical substance abuse in the past, which involved the death of this particular woman at her own hand in a very sad and also quite violent way. And also we understand that the main character also has issues with her father, not only because he owes him money because of this theater, but also there is a kind of very tense antagonistic relationship between the two men, which of course plays out, I think, very fittingly in terms of the narrative towards the denouement or climax, which involves the deaths of not just one of the men, but both of the men. So that, I think that's a very interesting way the narrative ties itself together very well. In terms of a narrative development, there is a clear and I think well delineated way in which the themes link into the narrative, and it's all parallel and leading to the same conclusion, which is the finding of this print, the watching of this print, and watching the results unfold. Speaking of the results, I must say this is also quite for the most part, this is a quest film. And I think John Carpenter mentions as much, which is that this is, for the most part, a pretty dialogue-dependent work. There is a lot of explanation, there's a lot of talking between characters, and a lot of talking about this particular film and the filmmakers and people who watched it at the time, and the film critic, and also the crew. There's a particular very grotesque scene involving finding a crew member or something to that nature. And there's also, well, let me get to that in a second, but for the most part, it is dialogue dependent, which is we hear a lot about what happened in the past, people who brushed up against screenings with respect to La Fin Absolue du Monde and the results that ensued. But we never necessarily see any kind of real gross out stuff, except as the work progresses, and by the very end, we never see any flashbacks per se to any of these, let's say, screenings of the film that are spoken about a lot. We see flashbacks to other aspects of the main character's life, don't get me wrong, but in terms of the film itself, we never get any flashback as to any screening that is talked about with great fear and trepidation, but we only get the dialogue. And so this is a very dialogue heavy episode, and I think John Carpenter in fact praises the episode or the script for being this dialogue dependent, because it relies more on our imagination and what we imagine this film, La Fin Absolue du Monde, to be, rather than actually seeing it. And I think John Carpenter mentions as much, which is that I think any kind of film showing of La Fin Absolue du Monde on screen would be a letdown, given how much it has been built up by all the characters in the film, Udo Kier in particular. And so, in fact, we do see a little segment or snippet of the film at the very end, and I think John Carpenter acknowledges that it might be a little bit of a letdown, and because you can't necessarily, satisfy all this buildup and create what must be the most horrifying film ever in existence. But there is something to be said about that, I think. But the film itself is shown in very snippets, and so it's not, in other words, the effect of this particular episode, in my opinion, is not directly reliant on the success or failure of the potent power of the scenes of the film as we actually see them played out. I think regardless of whether or not they are successful artistically, we still get enough here in terms of the build-up, in terms of of discussion of the filmmaker, what was Bakovic, and what happened to him, his wife, and finding out how the film actually affected Udo Kier and the manservant and all the violent carnage that occurs at the very end. And so I think the horror comes from how we see the film affecting others and how we hear of the stories about how the film affected others rather than the film itself. And I think that description and those after effects are, I think, the key to the horror of this particular work and the key to the success of the horror of this particular work, which is to say, therefore, that actually watching La Fin Absolue du Monde is perhaps, in an interesting paradoxical way, perhaps not the point of this particular episode, but the point more is the effect and the horror from that effect and the search and the ultimate horrific results from that end search. And I'm talking about the search of the main character. And speaking of those end results, there are some quite spectacular special effects here. Again, they're quite brief, but they are very, very bloody, very, very violent. And I would say also that we haven't necessarily seen this level of violence in John Carpenter's works in the past. Of course, we've seen very violent works in terms of The Thing and the over-the-top brilliant special effects that we saw there. We also saw a lot of violence play out even in films like Ghosts of Mars very recently. Special effects played out in The Mouth of Madness, etc., etc. Here, there is something of a real, almost brutal edge to the effects here. They are very bloody, and there is a lot of disembowelment, a lot of bloodletting, and that sort of thing. So it's actually quite disturbing. And let's compare it to The Thing, because The Thing, of course, is very violent, but there is almost a special effects sci-fi element to the carnage there. It's almost a surrealistic thing, which is almost away from a kind of realism in violence, if you know what I mean. Here, there is a real sense of bodies being damaged and not only damaged, but really quite spectacularly and grotesquely so. Not for the squeamish, that's for sure. And I would point out also the in particular the way in which the Udo Kier character turns out at the end. It's quite a so over the top, so violent, almost to be funny. Which is an interesting way of presenting this. And I would also say that this is an interesting aspect to John Carpenter's filmmaking. Taking Udo Kier's performance as an example, it is both horrifying, mysterious, scary, and funny. In particular, there's a bit at the beginning where Udo Kier is showing what we understand to be an angel who has been deformed because his wings have, we understand, been chopped off. And so there's this real almost perverse cruelty that Udo Kier's character does with throwing the ice cubes and that sort of thing. But it's done in a very over-the-top Udo Kier type of way. And so I think there is a real sense of comedy as well to the performance. And also that comedy plays out in the over-the-top, very stylized, just in-your-face violence that we see at the very end. So it's so gross, it's almost funny, if you understand what I mean. And I think that in an interesting, implicit way also plays into John Carpenter and his filmmaking sensibilities, because as we know, he is a filmmaker of many cloths. He is good with action, he is good with science fiction, he's good with horror, he's good with romance, he's good with drama, and he's good with comedy. And so here it makes sense, therefore, that we get a kind of blend or mixture of one or more genres within a piece that is directed by the one and only John Carpenter. Horror, mystery, film noir-ish elements, and comedy. And so I think going back full circle with my first comments here, John Carpenter and his sensibilities in terms of classical cinematic traditions, I think we see it played out here in its fullest and greatest context. So this is, in a nutshell, my take on the episode Cigarette Burns. I think that it does feel like an interesting turning point especially in how violence is portrayed, and also in the sense of how almost it feels, as I say, very earthy and very nihilistic. We've seen nihilism and pessimism play out in early John Carpenter films, of course, but here there seems to be an almost immediate edge to that nihilism and pessimism, and perhaps that might be something to be said about John Carpenter's filmmaking sensibilities as we enter into this new millennium. Again, it's not quite clear to me yet in terms of whether this is something that we can classify John Carpenter's later works to be as. But then again, we did see this strain of nihilism play out in his early works. And so in that way, perhaps we might also say that this is yet another connection to John Carpenter's filmography and his past, namely the way in which he is presenting pessimism and nihilism on screen in a way that is still horrifying, in keeping with a bloody sort of horror genre tradition, and also in keeping in the tradition that we have come to know and love from the works of John Carpenter. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And what do you think of this episode, Cigarette Burns? Do you like this episode? Do you not like this episode? In any event, my friends, please let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. And with that, I want to thank you very much. We will still keep going. We are almost done with the John Carpenter journey. So please join us for these final videos. We are almost finished, and there will be one summarizing, ranking video at the very end. So please stay tuned for that, which will be in a few videos from this one. So I hope you enjoy that. But before that, of course, we have a couple John Carpenter directed works that I would like to talk about. And so I look forward to seeing you there, my friends. In the meantime, please continue to be happy and healthy and well during these times. Take very good care of yourselves. Stay safe. And until we meet again, thank you and cheers.